Pope Francis is decrying expanding gun use. His latest comments come amid a wave of gun violence in the U.S.
The Pope expressed his concerns about gun use expansion in an exclusive interview with the Associated Press on Tuesday. He reflected on how, quote, instead of making the effort to help us live, end quote, humans are instead making the effort to help us kill. The Gun Violence Archive reports that 8 mass shootings have occurred in the U.S. since just this past weekend. 40 attacks in total have taken place since the start of the year.
Joining us now from Rome is CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay. Chris, the Pope has long spoken out against gun violence and the gun industry. And in fact, in this interview, he sort of indicated he wishes that there was something he could say that would make a difference. I'm wondering, are these comments about guns likely to have any tangible effects?
Who knows is the short answer to that question. As you mentioned, this is something that's near and dear to his heart, and he's never missed an opportunity to speak out against gun violence, specifically in the United States, where this problem is so acute. Most recently, that was after the Uvalde shooting. He used his general audience here in St. Peter's Square specifically to target what he called the indiscriminate trafficking of guns. And of course, he prayed for the victims, and he said that his heart was broken by that mass shooting. But he also said that this was a time in which leaders in the United States needed to ensure that this type of mass shooting could never happen again. And as you mentioned in my intro, it has happened many, many times since then. So unfortunately, his words so far haven't had the effect that he wants.
Yeah, and we'd be hard-pressed to find any one individual whose words would make an impact on what continues to be a pervasive issue here in the States. What is also interesting, Chris, is in his interview with the Associated Press, Pope Francis also said homosexuality is not a crime, but he didn't break from Catholic teachings that call homosexuality a sin. Elaborate for us on what he said and what the reaction is to that.
Right. Well, what's really interesting about his statements is how he specifically called laws in countries that do criminalize homosexuality unjust. And this does appear to be a first from Pope Francis, specifically in how he says that the Vatican could and should do more to encourage those countries that do consider it a crime to stop doing that. And he says this just ahead of a trip to Africa at the end of this month, where such laws that criminalize homosexual acts are rather commonplace. So there's a context for this, and there are countries in the world that don't just criminalize it, but you can be faced with serious penalties, even death. So that's the context that he's speaking from, and to see the Catholic Church use as an instrument to actually change these laws, that is a departure, because there are so many people within the Catholic Church, even his own bishops, some of them at least, who agree with some of these laws or have shown their support with these laws that criminalize gay acts. So to see him say that the church should be used as an instrument to actually push countries to decriminalize these laws, that does seem to be a first.
Yeah, that is much further than any modern pope has ever gone. Still not far enough for LGBTQ plus Catholics. Chris, I want to also ask you about what the Pope had to say about China. He said we must walk patiently with them. Tell us what's behind these comments. What does he mean by that?
Right. Well, there's a lot of context to go into here. One of the most recent pieces of news was the president of Taiwan actually sent a letter to Pope Francis saying that war with China was not an option. And this comes at a time, with the war in Ukraine, for instance, in which countries like Taiwan or like, Ukraine that are in the orbit of a great power that don't recognize their autonomy are certainly feeling under threat, and they're wanting to consolidate their allies. And the Vatican has always been one with Taiwan. It's one of the handful of countries in the world that actually recognizes its sovereignty as a state. It's the only state, the Vatican is the only state in Europe that recognizes Taiwan, for instance. And this comes also in the context, however, of the Vatican wanting to improve relations with China. In 2018, it came to an agreement with Beijing in which the Vatican would actually get to have the final say. The Pope would have the final say on its bishops. Up until that point, there was this divide in the Catholic Church in China, in which you had one half of the Catholic Church that didn't recognize the supremacy of the Pope, and then you had an underground Catholic Church in China that did. That changed in 2018, and now the Church in China recognizes the supremacy of the Pope. However, Beijing hasn't always gone along with those accords. As recently as November of last year, so just a few months ago, the Beijing actually nominated its own bishop without the agreement of the Vatican. And so the Pope is basically saying, look, we need to take baby steps here. We need to have patience. Of course, this isn't ideal, but he is desperate to have more dialogue with China. So he's calling on others in the Catholic Church to be patient.
Very interesting details emerging from this interview. Chris Livesay in Rome, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.